Well, because your contract.
Well, thank you so much for coming. I didn't know if anybody was going to show up tonight, but I think that you're all tired of being in the house. And so here you are.
No, we just couldn't wait.
You just couldn't wait.
Couldn't
wait. That's it. Well, thank you so much for coming back. When last we left our heroes, you will remember that Moses has finally gotten talked into going. We got a lot to talk about tonight, and I'm hoping I can get to all of it. I don't know. We're going to do a lot of stuff as we go through tonight. But Moses, you recall, had to get talked into getting down there. We had that really odd moment where God was going to kill him there before we get on back into Egypt. But fortunately, that was weird, but at least escaped any problems. And finally, Moses gets down with his brother Aaron and goes to talk to Pharaoh. And so we pick up here in chapter 5. Afterward, Moses and Aaron went to Pharaoh and said, "Thus says the Lord, the God of Israel." Thus says Yahweh. Notice he's using God's personal name here. "Let my people go." So I'm sure he did it in a really great Charlton Heston voice too, because you can't. Come on, Pharaoh, please. That doesn't work. It's got to be deep booming. They may celebrate a festival to me in the wilderness. But Pharaoh said, "Who is Yahweh?" So notice the question he's asking here. Who is Yahweh, that I should heed him and let Israel go? I don't know Yahweh, and I will not let Israel go. Then they said, "The God of the Hebrews has revealed himself to us. Let us go 3 days' journey into the wilderness to sacrifice to Yahweh our God, or he will fall upon us with pestilence or sword." But the king of Egypt said to them, "Moses and Aaron, why are you taking the people away from their work? Get to your labors." Pharaoh continued, "Now they are more numerous than the people of the land, yet you want them to stop working." That same day, Pharaoh commanded the taskmasters of the people, as well as their supervisors, "You shall no longer give the people straw to make bricks. As before, let them go gather straw for themselves, but you shall require them the same quantity of bricks as they've made previously. Do not diminish it, for they are lazy. That is why they cry, 'Let us go and offer sacrifice to our God.'" That's the problem. They're lazy. They just need to work harder, and they won't be asking to go pray. Although this provides a wonderful parable of most managers that I've known when the cutbacks come. We're expecting the same amount of work, but you won't have the same resources. So bricks without straw is a pretty common parable these days. "Let the heavier work be laid on them. Then they will labor at it and pay no attention to deceptive words." It's an interesting word, heavier. We're going to talk about that word in a little bit because that word kavod in Hebrew has a range of meanings. So he's failed now in his encounter with Pharaoh. So he turns to the Israelites, and the Israelites now are unhappy with him as well. So Moses goes back to God and says to the Lord, "O Lord, why have you mistreated this people? Why did you ever send me? Since I first came to Pharaoh to speak in your name, he's mistreated this people, and you've done nothing at all to deliver your people." So again, Moses not letting God off the hook for this call. This is another prophetic quality. You see this with prophets all the time. They didn't want to do the job to begin with, and while they're in the midst of the job, they have no problems telling God they didn't want the job still. And why in the word of God did you call me to this terrible occupation? Or in this case, vocation. So the Lord said to Moses, "Now you shall see what I will do to Pharaoh. Indeed, by a mighty hand he will let them go. By a mighty hand he will drive them out of the land." And then God revisits what he has already told Moses, again, to remind Moses of who God is and what God has done and all these great things. And I love Moses' response. The Lord spoke to Moses, "Go tell Pharaoh, king of Egypt, to let the Israelites go out of this land." But Moses spoke to the Lord, "The Israelites have not listened to me. How then shall Pharaoh listen to me? Poor speaker that I am." Thus the Lord spoke to Moses and Aaron and gave them orders regarding the Israelites and Pharaoh, king of Egypt, charging them to free the Israelites from the land of Egypt. I can't get anybody to listen to me. My own people don't want to listen to me. Why is Pharaoh going to listen to me at this point? And this is when the signs and wonders begin in this conversation. So we tried talking about it, and now we're going to have to show the authority that God has in this. And this is where it gets kind of exciting. This is where the part that gets Exodus a lot of action. A lot of things are happening here, this part of the story. So the Lord said to Moses and Aaron, "When Pharaoh says to you, 'Perform a wonder,' then you shall say to Aaron, 'Take your staff, throw it down before Pharaoh, and it will become a snake.' So Moses and Aaron went to Pharaoh and did as the Lord had commanded. Aaron threw down his staff before Pharaoh and his officials, and it became a snake. Then Pharaoh summoned the wise men, the sorcerers, and they also, the magicians of Egypt, did the same by their secret arts. Each one threw down his staff, and they became snakes. But Aaron's staff swallowed up theirs. Still, Pharaoh's heart was hardened, and he would not listen to them as the Lord had said." By the way, Moses was 80 when this started. So that, again, 2 generations old. He's a grown-up. That's what this means. This is, he's 3 phases of life. You have 40, 80, 120. You have childhood, adulthood, and grandparenthood, and that's when most of us go. 3 generations. He's 2 generations old, is what it's telling you in this age. So it's time for him to have his grown-up job, if you will. And so we have our first wonder, the staff becoming a snake. So how are we doing? Questions, comments, concerns? Okay. You all right, Bob?
No, I had a question, but I can't remember.
Was it about Pharaoh's hard heart?
No, it was early. It was when you started.
What?
Keep going.
Oh, we'll let that luggage come back around. I'm sure you'll have it.
I have a question about the secret acts.
Yes.
The secret
Those
arts.
musicians? Yes.
So it seems like initially Moses and Aaron are trying to do something that God commanded them to do.
Correct.
And like, well, you guys aren't that great. We can do the same thing.
Correct.
Even though Aaron's snake ate
the other 2 snakes.
like his snake was bigger than their snake.
Correct. Yes. Yes.
At this point, they're not establishing any kind of authority from God, in my opinion, in the events.
The presentation
as they're
needs
playing
some
out.
work, I think. Yeah. The show needs a little more pyrotechnics. We're gonna have to do something.
They haven't
flash.
given Pharaoh a chance.
No.
I mean, any reason to fear them yet.
No, you're exactly right. And the magicians can keep with him for a little while. In fact, the magicians hold up through the third plague, and then they can't reproduce it anymore. And so they're able to. Pharaoh's able to dismiss it, I think, from the beginning. First, who's Yahweh? Second, our snakes. We can make 2. You've only got the 1. And then we can make the Nile turn to blood. But then things start going kind of off the rails for him after that. And Pharaoh recognizes that. I mean, we're about to talk about these wonders that we have here, these plagues. Interesting, the word plague. You got it,
My
Bob?
question, yes.
Okay, came back around.
Way back, and it's right at first.
Okay.
When he said, free my people so they can hold a festival for me in the wilderness.
Yes.
There's no statement that they're going to leave permanently.
Not to Pharaoh, no.
Yeah.
No. And Moses told Jethro, I'm going to go back to Egypt and see if anybody's alive. So yeah, there's not a whole lot of, we're not being completely honest about the situation here with Pharaoh anyway.
So Pharaoh's a pretty smart guy.
Yeah.
Because he recognizes that.
Yes. and so you're just going to go and take my workforce and then, no, I'm not going to let that happen. So, yes. Barbara.
Are we to assume that these are magicians who can do tricks?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. With their secret arts. Yeah, they can. That's how they get those nice jobs. They can do impressive things that seem to speak for the God. They seem to be speaking with, and anything they do would be perceived as being the gods of Egypt working through them. Right? This is not David Copperfield coming in doing this. This is the magicians are representing the religions of Egypt. And so this entire story, and this is an important part for understanding this story. This entire story is not God versus Pharaoh or Pharaoh versus Moses. This whole story is God versus the God of Egypt. Pharaoh was seen as incarnate God on earth. He saw himself that way, the people saw it that way. So this battle comes between 2 gods. As far as any ancient hearer would hear this story. This is who is the true God in this story. And God is claiming he's going to have power over this. He told Moses to begin with that he's going to harden Pharaoh's heart. And now we see that Pharaoh's heart was hardened. I jumped right off of that, didn't I? Pharaoh's heart was hardened and would not listen. This has caused people trouble for years on exactly what is being meant by hardened his heart. What is that? There are several times God hardens Pharaoh's heart. There are several times Pharaoh hardens Pharaoh's heart, and there are several times Pharaoh's heart is hardened, and we don't blame anybody on that one. Just use the passive voice. It just was hardened. We're not saying who. And there's a lot going on there. I think remembering that this is a battle between 2 gods is important, and God is claiming superiority. I think there's also an understanding of afterlife in this, and the Egyptian afterlife is interesting because when the Pharaoh died, he was taken into the presence of Osiris, and his heart was weighed against the feather of the god of truth, Ma'at. So there's a feather on the scales, and Pharaoh's heart is on the scale. And Pharaoh then has to recite this code that tells all the things he didn't do. I didn't lie, I didn't cheat people, I didn't do these things. And he has to, it's like 52 sayings that you have to recite. And if your heart ends up heavier than, or if your heart is lighter than the feather, after this event, then you get to go on into the afterlife and everything is fine. If your heart is heavier than the feather after this recitation, then the god Amit, who is half crocodile, half hippopotamus, sitting there by the scales, eats you. And so that's what happens in this. So a light heart is important for Pharaoh going into the afterlife. And this word for hardened is exactly the same word for heavy in Hebrew, kavod. There are several words that are used for hardening here. There's one strengthens, there's one stiffens, but the most common one is the word that here, kavod, heaviness. He made the heart heavy, hardened.
But we use heavy kind
A
of.
heavy heart? A little different. Yeah,
it's
our idiom's different.
It
Yeah.
means that you're sorry about, you're worried about something, you're sorry or
Well,
whatever.
another problem we have is our heart in our idioms is the seat of emotion. And in Israel, the heart was the seat of reason. The heart was where you made your decisions from. So his decision making has been resolved and hardened as well. So that's why the fool says in his heart there is no God, is the fool says in his decision making, by the way in which he lives his life, the choices that the fool makes. That's the problem with the fool, is that practical atheism. Yeah, the heart is a place of reason in the ancient. The emotions were kept in the bowels for ancient Israel. Yeah, which makes more sense. That's where you feel them, I think. Nerves, butterflies are in your stomach. I mean, we even use that. So yeah, I have a great depiction from the Book of the Dead. I picked this up at the Oriental Institute in Chicago, and it's a depiction of the afterlife scene. So you have Ma'at here, you have Osiris, you have the scales, and here the weight. There's a feather. You can barely make out the feather in the heart, and here's the god Amit, ready to consume the soul of the person whose heart is too heavy. So you can pass that around. Yeah, and if you're watching on Facebook, if you Google the Book of the Dead scales, I'm sure you can see it. This is I don't blame God as much on this one. I mean, I'm as free will as anybody in this. I've said before, I tend toward the open theist interpretations of things. But this doesn't trouble me too much, because again, this is the way the ancients would have viewed this, the battle between the two gods, and I don't have a problem with God. I guess what I can say is this: it doesn't take a whole lot of foreknowledge to know that when you confront the person who thinks himself God on earth, deity himself, as arrogant as a human being can possibly be, and tell him what he needs to do as the foreigner, you don't need foreknowledge to know how that guy's going to respond to me. I mean, I know how Pharaoh's going to respond when Moses says this to Pharaoh. So this doesn't bother me too much. It does bother some. But the point of the whole story is God's in complete control of this. I mean, that's really sort of where we're going. And one of the ways God shows control is with the plagues. As I said, interesting, the word plagues is not used in Hebrew. The only place the word plague occurs is with the 10th, the death of the firstborn. That's the only one that is specifically called a plague. The others are called signs and wonders. That God's going to work these signs and wonders. And I don't know how much I want to make of that, but I do think it's significant that word isn't being used. Like when I said that when the man and the woman are punished after the fall, the word curse is only used of the ground and the serpent. The word curse is not used of humanity. I think that's significant too. So, yeah, go ahead.
So the same signs and wonders, like when it would have been translated into the Greek, is that the same that was used in the New Testament?
Probably, Samayan, yeah. I don't know why that Greek word stuck in my head, but yes, that's the Greek word for signs. Probably got that one beat in, obviously. But it's stick. Yeah, the Hebrew word for plague is neged, which is also the word for touch, which is kind of interesting. It's the same word that is used when Zipporah touches the foreskin to Moses' feet at this episode in Exodus 4. That word is there, and I think it's used when Moses touches the water with his staff, I think. But yeah, so it's the Hebrew word for touch in other contexts can be used to mean can mean plague. As far as these 10 marvels, these 10 plagues, I've seen obviously there's a lot of ink been spilled on these things. Some see them as triumph of Yahweh over specific Egyptian gods. And it's true, there are some gods, flies and gnats and that sort of thing, that you could point to and say, oh, look, here's a place where God is showing that he's in control of this element of nature, and the Egyptian God is not in control of this element of nature. And okay, that works, but that only works for like 6 of these. And so I don't go too far into the let's match these God up thing. There do seem to be 3 cycles of 3. There are some rhetorical clues in that. There's a warning given to Pharaoh before the 1st, 4th, and 7th in the morning. There's a warning given to Pharaoh before the 2nd, 5th, and 8th in the that's not given time. He's just warning. And then the 3rd, 6th, and 9th don't have any warning associated with them. So there does seem to sort of be a rhetorical, almost a chorus-like happening with those 3. And then the 10th comes along and does something totally different and breaks that cycle. So I do think it's 3, but I've seen people go crazy with this. Well, the first 3 deal with this, and the next 3 deal with that, and okay, no, I'm sorry, I don't buy that. Making a difference between the one that drives me crazy on that is they make a difference between the frogs and the gnats. Those are 2 obviously different types of plagues. Really? They're that different to you, are they? I mean, I'll go with darkness being different than gnats, but frogs and gnats seem to at least be in the same ballpark. So I don't go crazy with this, but I do think rhetorically speaking, it is an interesting breaking up of that. There is this huge, and this may not bother you at all, there's a lot of, I have a problem with students on this, a lot of ink again spilled on miracles versus natural events that are being interpreted here. I don't spend too much time on this because as far as the ancient Israelite was concerned, there's no difference between that. There is no difference between supernatural and natural in the mind of the ancients. Everything is of the gods. Everything comes directly from them or not. So there's no way to divide that. And I also don't like, personally, David Hume's definition of miracle. And that is something without an explanation, something supernatural, something that cannot be explained. Because I've had plenty of things that I can give you explanation for in my life that were no less miraculous in my life. I mean, the one example I can always give is when, after my parents' divorce, I was in college, and my dad was the primary breadwinner. My mom was an administrative assistant. I've said many times after Dad left, it was food, clothing, or shelter. We had our choice of any 2. And it was a very hard time. And we had some bill that was coming up, and I have no idea what the bill was, but it was something like $500 that we weren't going to be able to come up with. And we just weren't going to be able to come up with it. It was just going to pass, and we just didn't know what was going to happen. And the day before the bill is due, we go out to the mailbox, and there'd been an escrow refund from the bank for $15 more than the bill was for. Now, I can give you all the reasons that happened. I can give you the natural explanation for banks periodically auditing escrow accounts to make sure that, I can give you all of that, but there's nothing you can say that won't make that a miraculous event in my life. I mean, so for me, the definition of miracle for too many people is too insufficient. If you want to tie these to one-time crazy God reaching into the fish tank to set the little swimmer back up, or that kind of reaching in from the outside to work miracles, that's fine. If you wanted to find a way that connects these plagues to a flooding of the Nile that was more severe this year than other years, that works for me too. It makes no difference to me, and Israel wouldn't have understood the difference anyway. They would have understood Yahweh as the one who was acting behind that completely. So I don't worry too much about that, but some people worry a lot about that. Some think if they can't explain it, it proves it's God. Some think if they can explain it, it proves it's God. I think that we're just going to have to trust it's God. That's kind of how faith works. So that's what I want to say about those. Questions on that? Yes, sir. I love how you, is this a question, or sometimes you have this sort of,
I'm offering it to you.
Offer my question, yes.
It feels like I actually have something I need to see
I shall receive your questions.
Thank you. Reading through this, at least in English, it seems like there's a lot of repetition
Yes.
going on. Are there any hints in the ancients, in the ancient language, this could be like some kind of oral tradition core?
Yeah, I think that's certain. I think all of these stories started as oral tradition. I think that when you get stories duplicated like that, we're probably looking at sources that have been put together. This is not explicitly poetry, at least this section is not poetry, it's in prose. And so you don't have the repetition at the verse level, but absolutely you see some stories kind of, in 2 different places that seem to be telling the same kind of story. Yeah. I think that's probably, pointing at that oral tradition that these things have been redacted together over time. Yeah.
And another question,
Sure.
just because there's so many instances of words having 2 meanings. Just curious, do you know about how big the lexicon of the ancient Hebrew language is? We say English is about 600,000 words.
Yeah.
And the average language on it is about 100,000.
No, if I'd be making it up if I tried.
That's total curiosity.
I know that in the New Testament, one of the frustrations I had as an Old Testament guy is that in New Testament, the entire New Testament is written at the outside, in 70 or 80 years. And as a result, most New Testament scholars can know the vocabulary, the Greek vocabulary of the entire New Testament. I mean, that's not a problem. The Hebrew text comes together over generously 1,000 years. And it's bigger, and the words that are the range, I mean, think about English over 1,000 years. And Hebrew doesn't change that much, but it certainly is different, and the way words are used is different. And you can never get a handle on being, I mean, my Greek professors were able to, and even I, for a time, was able to preach from the Greek New Testament. You could almost do the translation on the fly if you've worked through it ahead of time. In Hebrew, I would never try that, because I'm going to get stuck on a word, just as sure as anything. So, yeah, Hebrew has a lot more hapax legomena, a lot more vocabulary, and then some of it's in Aramaic too. So it gets complicated. So it's like imagining, you've got a giant Spanish text that has large sections in Portuguese, surprisingly. I mean, that's basically what happens in the Old Testament. So that's what happens when your book comes together over time. We don't have that great miracle story. We talked about that at the men's retreat. We don't have that sexy origin story for the Bible. We don't have angels speaking to people, and we don't have golden tablets, or we don't have it. We saved the book over time. I mean, we have a lot of the New Testament because we saved a guy's mail. I mean, it's like really kind of awesome, actually. God taking this incredibly ordinary process and doing something extraordinary with it and giving us the biblical text. So, this was what I meant: the gnats and flies, not frogs and gnats. Gnats and flies, obviously two completely different plagues. Really? Because that seems like that's in the same ballpark there, but okay. Obviously, plague of the firstborn is the huge, the big plague at the end. Pharaoh summoned Moses and Aaron and said to them, this time, this is, by the way, this is a clip from the darkness, I believe. Or no, this is the hail and thunder clip. That's what this is. So hail and thunder are coming. So now, it's bad enough we've had these issues. It's become clear that God has control over the created order as well. So creation itself now has gotten involved in these plagues. And so Pharaoh finally has had enough. Pharaoh summoned Moses and Aaron and said to them, this time I've sinned. The Lord, Yahweh, is in the right, and I and my people are in the wrong. Pray to Yahweh, enough of God's thunder and hail. I will let you go. You need to stay no longer. Moses said to him, as soon as I've gone out of the city, I'll stretch out my hand to the Lord. The thunder will cease. There'll be no more hail, so that you may know the earth is the Lord's. But as for you and your officials, I know that you do not yet fear the Lord God. Now the flax and barley were ruined, for the barley was in the ear and the flax was in the bud. But the wheat and the spelt were not ruined, for they're late in coming up, which is apparently important to this story for some reason, but I have no idea why. This is one of those times when, interesting, the flax, I had no idea. That does provide some interpretive clues, I think.
Well, it tells you what time of the year.
That's true. Does that help?
Well, it gives you an idea of how much
What is biblical
damage,
scholars arguing for this now?
how much damage might have been done.
They've lost half their crops. Yeah,
as to
basically.
where the crops were at
Sure.
the time, where they were ready for.
Well, Moses left Pharaoh, went out of the city, stretched out his hands to the Lord. Then thunder and hail ceased. The rain no longer poured down on the earth. But when Pharaoh saw the rain and the hail and the thunder had ceased, he sinned once more, hardened his heart. So this one's Pharaoh's fault. He and his officials. So the heart of Pharaoh was hardened. I won't say who. And he would not let the Israelites go, just as the Lord had spoken through Moses. Boy, God has got Pharaoh's number on this one. I mean, Moses might think he might be getting somewhere, but God's told him it's not going to happen. Not going to happen until you get to the end of this story. So the Lord said to Moses, I'll bring one more plague upon Pharaoh. It's the only time this word happens here, is in the story. It's plague. I don't know what that means, but I think it's interesting. And upon Egypt afterwards, he will let you go from here. Indeed, when he lets you go, he will drive you away. Tell the people that every man is to ask his neighbor and every woman is to ask her neighbor for objects of silver and gold. So we're fleecing Egypt as we leave as well. The Lord gave people favor in the sight of the Egyptians. Moreover, Moses himself was a man of great importance in the land of Egypt, in the sight of Pharaoh's officials, and in the sight of the people. Everyone else gets it. This guy knows he's representing a God that's bigger. So now, basically, Egypt has turned against Pharaoh, but Pharaoh's still the one in charge. Moses says, thus says the Lord, about midnight I will go out through Egypt. Notice God says, I will go out. In the movies, we always soften this. In the movies, it's always the death angel that's going out and doing this, but not in the Exodus. It is God who claims God is going to go out in the midst through Egypt. Every firstborn in the land of Egypt shall die, from the firstborn of Pharaoh who sits on the throne to the firstborn of the female slave who's behind the handmill, all the firstborn of the livestock. Then there will be a loud cry throughout the whole land of Egypt, such as never been or will ever be again. But not a dog shall growl at any of the Israelites, not a people, not at animals, so that you may know the Lord makes a distinction between Egypt and Israel. Then all these officials of yours shall come down to me, bow low to me, saying, leave us, you and all the people who follow you. After that I will leave. And in hot anger he left Pharaoh. The Lord said to Moses, Pharaoh will not listen to you, in order that any wonders may be multiplied in the land of Egypt. Moses and Aaron performed all these wonders before Pharaoh, but the Lord hardened Pharaoh's heart, and he did not let the people of Israel out of the land. So this, of course, gives us the Passover meal. God says that when the blood is on the lintel of the doors, he will pass over that house, and the plague will not enter into that. Where a sheep or goat is sacrificed, all of it is eaten. The blood's put on the doorpost, which afterwards gives us the feast of the unleavened bread. Not the feet, that would be different. The feast of the unleavened bread. Matzot, because we don't have time to let the bread rise. There's no time to let the yeast work. We've only got time for crackers. And so that's the point of the story. We can cook crackers, and we can get those ready, and we can eat those. Celebrated every March and April. And it's a meal that is participatory, an interpreted meal. It's one that is meant to associate the eater with the story itself. So the point of this is not just to remember, but it's to be a participant in. These were the tears of our oppression. These were the bitter herbs of our servitude. The symbolic foods are meant to actually associate the individual to live and feel and experience as though Pharaoh was after them in that story as well. So I think that's important because it's not historical remembrance for them. Every generation is to experience Passover. Every generation is to experience this as though they themselves have lived it. And that it's different. I've often compared the difference between 4th of July and Martin Luther King, where 4th of July is often celebrated in remembrance and hot dogs and barbecues and fireworks, and very often Martin Luther King's is celebrated, and particularly ones in the South, by acts of service. That there were marches through towns and will be on Monday in celebration of Martin Luther King as a way of sort of participating in the remembrance of that. And so that's a difference, I think, in the kind of ways those holidays are looked at. In the same way with Passover is different than just a remembrance. So questions, comments?
This, the last one, obviously the most dramatic.
Yes.
More of a comment than anything else. I've always thought that there had to have been some demographic catastrophe that was captured that is in the story. That is what it is.
So that there's some historical reference that this is pointing to?
You don't just make this up.
Yeah, right. No, that's right. I think that's right. Yeah.
I'm going to bounce off that. Later and sort of spoil later in Exodus.
Yes.
Or no, maybe this was further in Genesis, but where he says, you'll spare your firstborn as part of your covenant with me.
Okay.
Does this...
In Leviticus, you set aside the firstborn as a covenant to God.
Am I thinking
the animals.
of later in Exodus or earlier in Genesis?
I'm not sure where you are at this point.
That quote exists. I remember.
Okay, I believe you.
Wondering whether there was some tradition surrounding the firstborn, either with sacrifice.
Well, the firstborn was, the firstborn of the animals were always the most precious and given in service and given in offering and that kind of thing. So.
Okay, my homework for this week is to look at.
Is to find that verse. Absolutely. Yeah, do that. Pharaoh lets them go. They go, and it says some of the aliens that were with them, so some of the other people that were in Egypt also escaped as well. Yeah.
I can't let this go.
What?
How might we reconcile the notion that God is love and God wiped out all of the firstborn?
Don't get ahead of the story. I'm not
Give
going to
me a
leave
clue.
you. I promise I won't leave you there.
Okay.
Okay. I promise I
enough.
won't. I promise I won't leave you there. But I got to pick up the pace.
Okay.
So Pharaoh has a change of heart, of course. Pharaoh drew near. The Israelites look back. So he chases them out to the edge of the Red Sea. The Egyptians were advancing on them in great fear. The Israelites cried out to the Lord. They said to Moses, "Was it because there was no graves in Egypt you taking us out to die in the wilderness?" These people are never happy. Can't make anyone happy. "What have you done to us, bringing us out of Egypt? Is this not the very thing we told you in Egypt? Let us alone, let us serve the Egyptians. It would have been better for us to serve the Egyptians than die in the wilderness." But Moses said to the people, "Do not be afraid, stand firm, and see the deliverance the Lord will accomplish for you today. For the Egyptians whom you see today, you'll never see again. The Lord will fight for you, and you have only to keep still." I love God's response. Then the Lord said to Moses, "Why do you cry out to me?" It's like Moses has this great moment of faith, and God's like, what? Okay. Tell the Israelites to go forward, but you lift up your staff, stretch it out over your hand in the sea, divide it, and the Israelites will go into the sea on dry ground. I will harden the hearts of the Egyptians, they will go in after them, and so I will gain glory for myself, which is also a word, kavod, which is also the word for heaviness. Glory and heavy and harden are all the same word there, so I gotta believe that we're having fun with that language as we get through. Over Pharaoh and all his armies, chariots, chariot drivers, and the Egyptians shall know that I'm the Lord, when I've gained glory for myself over Pharaoh, his chariots, and chariot drivers. The angel of the Lord, who's going before the Israelite army, or the messenger of the Lord, there's no Hebrew word for angel. You have to decide whether or not, if the translator said angel in the Old Testament, it means they've decided this is clearly a divine being. I think we're safe on that one. That's a good choice here. Took its place behind them. It came between the army of Egypt and the army of Israel. So the cloud was there with the darkness. It lit up at night, and one did not come near the other all night. Moses stretched out his hand over the sea. The Lord drove the sea back by a strong east wind all night and turned the sea into dry land, and the waters were divided. Same exact phrase as Genesis 1, by the way. Waters were divided, same language. So this is without question invoking creation imagery as it thinks about this. We're creating Israel as a nation, and the chaos waters are being split here once again. The Israelites went into the sea on dry ground, the waters forming a wall for them on the right and on the left. The Egyptians pursued, went into the sea after them, all of Pharaoh's horses and chariots and chariot drivers. The morning watch, the Lord in a pillar of fire and cloud looked down upon the Egyptian army, threw the Egyptian army into panic, clogged the chariot wheels so they turned with difficulty, and the Egyptians said, let's flee from the Israelites, the Lord is fighting for them against Egypt. The Lord said to Moses, stretch out your hand over the sea, so that the water may come back upon the Egyptians, upon their chariots and chariot drivers. So Moses stretched out his hand over the sea, and at the dawn the sea returned to its normal depth. As the Egyptians fled before it, the Lord tossed the Egyptians into the sea. The waters returned and covered the chariots and chariot drivers, so chaos came back over Egypt. The entire army of Pharaoh had followed them into the sea. Not one of them remained, but the Israelites walked on dry ground through the sea, the waters forming a wall for them on the right and on the left. There's that repetition you were talking about as you get through, I think, absolutely. Well, there's nothing to do after that but write a song about it. So we'll talk about the song in a second. The miracle at the Red Sea, in Hebrew, it is Yom Suf. But if you've been with me from the beginning of Genesis, you know that Suf is not the Hebrew word for red. Because what's the Hebrew word for red? Do you remember? I think I said it twice. Twice? I repeated myself. That's what professors are supposed to do, right? Edom, or Adam, is the word for red. So remember, Esau was red, and so it had that red. Yom Suf. Suf is the word for reeds. And so this, of course, has been a point of great contention that scholars have spent all sorts of time with, Yom Suf. But I don't care, because you'll remember the original text is unpointed. There are no vowels there. You probably noticed that right away. No vowels right there. When you put vowels in this word, you have two ways of pointing it. Yom Suf, Sea of Reeds, which is the way the Masoretes have pointed it. Yom Sof. Sof is the word for end. The Sof Pasuk is the end of the sentence. It's a period. Basically, it's what the name for a period is. A Sof Pasuk, end of the sentence. I think that, let me put it this way. There is absolutely, in my mind, it's absolutely clear that the text is talking about what we understand as the Red Sea. Whatever you want to call it, that's fine. Yes, there are no reeds in the Red Sea. I understand that. I think it's perfectly understandable to think of the Red Sea as the sea of the end of the world, because you can get to that one and there's no other land after that if you go south in that direction. We didn't know about Antarctica at this point, so stay with me. And so I have no problems interpreting this as understanding it as the Red Sea. I don't think they were thinking of the Reed Sea. I don't think they were thinking about a 6-inch deep pool. I don't think that's what it was. I think that Israel is literally and figuratively at the end, without God intervening and making a way through the end for them to the other side. That works from a literary perspective, and I think it works from a narrative perspective as you're going through the story. But we do get that birth of Israel as a nation and people. Then once they're on the other side, we write a song about it. Moses and Israel sang this. Here's where we get into our poetry that we're talking about. I will sing to the Lord, for he has triumphed gloriously. Shira ladonai kigo ga'a. The song at the end of the Prince of Egypt that they sing in Hebrew, the text comes directly from this song of Moses and the song of Miriam. And I don't want to skip her. Moses is a real long song. Miriam's is short, but most people think that she started it and he copied her. They actually do think that, actually. But she says, sing to the Lord, for he has triumphed gloriously. shira la and horse and rider. This is a phrase you will find a lot after that. So, questions on that before I help Bob? So I really want to help Bob on this, because this is important. I think it is important. Okay, before I help Bob, I have to tell you how many Israelites there were. How many Israelites were there? Cecil B. DeMille says there were 2.5 million Israelites that went out. We got some problems with that. Traditional translations of the numbers in the book of Numbers give 600,000 men of fighting age. 600,000 men of fighting age would give us that 2.5 million number that Cecil B. DeMille is quoting and that most people look at when they're talking about this. There's some real problems with over 2 million people coming out of Egypt. One, the land of Goshen nor the land of Canaan could support that many people at this time. Two, 2 million people don't have to wait for God to deliver them. 2 million people go wherever 2 million people want to go. I mean, the people around the edges will die, sure, but most of you are going to get where you're going when you're an army of 2 million people. This would outnumber, I think this would make, if there's 600,000 men of fighting age, if I remember the numbers right, that is something like 20 to 1 you would outnumber the army of Egypt at this time, which makes very little sense in the story. There were 2 midwives. For 2.5 million people, there were 2 midwives? Well, this certainly explains their story to Pharaoh. I don't know, they'd given birth by the time we got there. Well, of course they have. You'd have to be bionic for 2 million people to have 2. I mean, the city of Waco had about 250,000 in the Mclean County area, and there were 10 births a day at the hospital. There'd be 100 births a day that these poor girls would have to deal with. No way. After 430 years, 70 people that went down into Egypt doesn't make 2.5 million. Closer to 10,000, biologists tell us. I'm okay with God making them a little more fruitful, but they're not having a litter of puppies every time they have children, which you would need to get to 2.5 million. And the crushing defeat at the Battle of Ai in Joshua, 36 men. Well, 36 would die of old age before the battle was over if we had 2.5 million going in here. So the text is telling us, I think, we're translating this number incorrectly. And then the word that we're dealing with is this word aleph. Aleph is actually the first letter of the Hebrew alphabet. And it is also originally etymologically connected to a head of cattle. In fact, originally the word looked like a cattle head. You take the letter A, flip it upside down, that's what an aleph used to look like, which looks like a cow if you put a little, it got flipped by the Phoenician. After it was used as a head of cattle, it began to be used by kings as the number that a household or city would have to conscript for military service. A town or a family would have to give a certain number of aleph, a certain number of units, if you will. Eventually that gets standardized up to 1,000, I think, once there are enough people in the land. The term grows to mean a really large size, usually is 1,000. If you retranslate the book of Numbers, instead of 600,000, you get 600 units. So that the tribe of Dan has 12 units totaling 600 instead of 12,600. That's a perfectly legitimate way of translating that phrase. Then the number comes back down to about 20,000 or 25,000. I'm okay with God making them twice as fruitful. That one makes me feel a little bit better. And also, that fits the story better, right? The story is not a large group of people got to go wherever they wanted. The story was this small, insignificant group was protected, led, helped by God, and provided for. Someone had no hope apart from God. So this word, the numbers, boy, it's problematic to translate. I think that tradition and translation have done us a disservice in trying to think about what number we're supposed to be thinking about. Because over time, now it's just come to be 600,000. And that's what Cecil B. DeMille is going with, but he and I disagree. I love what Prince of Egypt did, because sometimes at the end of the movie, it looks like there's probably about 10,000 people there, and then sometimes at the end it looks like there's like 2.5 million. So they're trying to make everybody happy with that ending. But questions I can answer on that? That limits the questions. No, are there questions? All right. Now I want to make Bob feel better. To do this, we're going to watch a movie. See, I told you we got all sorts of fun things happening tonight. First, we're going to watch The Untouchables, because, Chicago, got to do this. So, see how this works.
You said you wanted to know how to get to Capone. Do you really want to go? You see what I'm saying? What are you prepared to do?
Everything within the law.
these people, Mr. Nash, you must be prepared to go all the way. Because they won't give up the fight until one of you is dead.
I want to get Capone. I don't know how to get him.
Want to get Capone? Here's how you get him. He pulls a knife, you pull a gun. He sends one of yours to the hospital, you send one of his to the morgue. That's the Chicago. That's how you get Capone. Now, do you want to do that? Are you ready to do that? I'm making you a deal. Do you want this deal?
I have sworn to put this man away with any and all legal means at my disposal, and I will do so.
No, he is a coward. Do you know what a blood oath is, Mr. Ness?
Yes.
Good. Because you just took one.
Okay, so that gives us one perspective, the Chicago way, which is violence is met with more violence. Anybody with siblings has no problems understanding the Chicago way, right? I mean, because your brother or sister comes in and punches you, you don't punch them with equal or less ferocity. Your job is to escalate it until one of you has ended up breaking something or a parent has intervened, right? That's just the way that goes when you have siblings. If I go down into downtown Chicago and I punch a gangbanger in the nose, he's not going to respond with equal and opposite violence. He's going to kill me. He's going to kill me. He's going to kill my family. He's probably going to kill you people just to make sure that we understand what it is to show disrespect. That's the world of Chicago, and that's the world of the ancient Near East. That's tribal violence that you have, which is why God provided Lex Talionis. Lex Talionis comes in the book of Exodus. And in chapter 21, if any harm follows, you shall give life for eye, eye for eye, tooth for tooth, hand for hand, foot for foot, burn for burn, wound for wound, stripe for stripe. The point of Lex Talionis was that the response to the violent must be equal to the violence that's suffered. If someone bloodies your nose, you're only allowed to bloody their nose. You're not allowed to kill them. Right? So originally, I know we don't think of the law of retaliation as a merciful one, eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth, but that was really what its original intention was to be, to place limits on vengeance, to actually show some kind of level of mercy. All right. For the third thing I want to talk about, I want to talk about another movie. I'm going to show you a clip from another movie. Anyone ever seen The Mission, 1986, Robert De Niro? Great. Oh, see, my students have never seen this movie. This is why it's great to have a well-seasoned group that has this appreciation for it. Yeah. If you don't know the movie, it stars Robert De Niro is an 18th century Spanish conquistador, for lack of a better term, and he's in South America. He has engaged in slave trade for most of his life. He's murdered and led out campaigns against them. Been incredibly cruel in rounding them up, selling them, and crushing them. He finds his fiancée in bed with his brother and kills his brother. He is acquitted of this. It's a crime of passion. Everybody understood it was no problem, but he's racked with guilt about what to do. So he goes to a Catholic priest, a Jesuit who has a mission in the midst and has been ministering to the indigenous population, and says, what do I do? How do I find forgiveness for this? And so Father Gabriel, who is played by Jeremy Irons, this is 1980, so it's young Jeremy Irons, young Liam Neeson, younger Robert De Niro. And Jeremy Irons' character says to him, here's what we need to do for a penance. You take all the instruments of war that you've had for your life, your swords, your spears, your armor, you wear them, you put them in a bundle, and you carry them on a journey from here into the wild to the mission. So you bring along this burden to meet these indigenous people. Okay, so that's sort of the setting of the story that we come in here. It's a really interesting movie. We're catching Mendoza, the Robert De Niro character, on his journey. Sounds too right. Lost the sound completely now. It's a beautiful scene. He's overcome with emotion. The tribesmen hug him. The priests are overwhelmed. This actual act of literally cutting his burden off of him and throwing it over the waterfall, and this act of forgiveness from a group of people that they had every right by any rule of war or any rule of the Lex Talionis to take his life. His life was theirs for the taking, and they show this beautiful, beautiful act of forgiveness. Which is another way to respond to violence. In this case, the violence is forgiven that they have suffered. So here's my question for you. Given those three options, the Chicago way, Lex Talionis, and the native tribesmen in the mission, which best characterizes God in the Exodus story that you think, and why? Of those three, which most closely, is God ramping it up? Does God respond in kind, or does God provide a measure of forgiveness in this story?
All right, what were the original ills inflicted on the Israelites? Because if I'm keeping track, it's just forced labor.
You're gonna tabulate that?
We got column A,
Yeah.
what the Egyptians did to them, and column B, what they did to the Egyptians.
Mm-hmm.
Column A, I'm thinking it's forced labor and servitude.
It is, and trying to breed them away, the destruction of the boys,
That's right.
enslavement.
That's the one I was forgetting. Okay.
Yeah.
See, I knew I was overlooking something.
And all that comes with that. What do you think? I see how long I can give you.
Number one.
You think it's number one? You think God's ramping it up? Pharaoh pulled a knife, God pulled a gun. Okay. Number two, you see God responding in kind. Okay.
You killed my children, I'm taking yours.
Killing your children. Okay. Any votes for three? Okay, I can't give you three, but I bet that I can get you closer to three than you thought you could when you came in this evening. Would you like me to do that for you? Make God look a little more like three than certainly like one? Thought you might like that. Let me try and help with this. What was the original transgression of Pharaoh against Israel? We alluded to it a second ago. I actually said it.
He tried to breed them away.
Yes, which ones?
Firstborns.
Try again.
Firstborn males. It was all males.
It
right?
was all males,
Just all
correct.
males.
Right, he tries to kill all the males of Israel.
Yeah.
Which males did God kill?
Just the firstborn.
Yeah, just killed the firstborn. Now, what I'm suggesting here is this. According to Lex Talionis, God would be perfectly within his legal right, if we can say that about God, to take all of the males of Egypt. Pharaoh tried to kill all of the males of Israel. God is completely entitled to take all the males of Egypt. God does not. God brings...
What about when the water comes over the
All the
whole
army? Yeah, well,
which are-
they shouldn't have followed so close. Tailgating will always get you in trouble. That's the lesson on that. That's not part of the story. Part of the story. That one I can blame on their dumb choice. You know, right? When the Red Sea is parted, don't drive in. This seems pretty self-explanatory. No, but the firstborn, just taking the firstborn son, when God is entitled to take all of this. This is an act of, this is an act of mercy with regard to justice in this regard. But here's the other part that I think we miss. To any ancient Near Eastern reader of this text, God comes off as, the best word I could give you is weak. You're never going to, the entire ancient Near East is based on the Chicago way. If you offend the Assyrian Empire, the Persian Empire, the Greek Empire, the Egyptians, you're going to be made examples of, always. In fact, the Assyrians were famous for weaponizing terrorism and taking pictures of it and putting it in their castles to show people what happened when you crossed the king. He was always going to take it to a higher level. For God to respond by not taking it to a higher level, by actually not coming within 90% of what God would have been entitled to do as a response, would have seemed to the ancient reader as strange to us as turn the other cheek. I realize that from our perspective, we're still thinking about these individuals. We're still thinking about the how we reconcile this with the person we get of Jesus, and I completely am with you on that. But I also understand that God is working within a worldview that these people understood. And that lesson would have come through to them far better than it comes through to us, of God not going as far as Lex Talionis. So I'm not trying to claim God's on 3 here. I get that. But he's a lot closer to 3 than he is to 1, I think, in a reading of the text, personally. Did that convince anyone?
I don't think you can dismiss what happened at the sea when
with the army that comes in.
Yes, and raise your shaft, and the sea will come upon them.
Yeah. Well, in fairness,
he wiped out the army.
In fairness, God also didn't. Why are you asking me about this? That's how you opened that conversation too. Yeah, I don't. The army doesn't bother me as much, I think, in that regard, because it is that's one that you can tie to. That's one you can tie to their choice, as opposed to one I'm not going to tie.
You raise
to.
your shaft, and the sea will come over them.
Yes.
He told them to do it, and it did.
Yes.
It wasn't a bad choice.
It was a bad choice by the Egyptians, is my point.
No, I don't think so. They were following.
Yes, into the Red Sea,
and
after they've told them they could go.
It could have stayed just that way, but he said, no, you raise your shaft now, and I'll bring the waters down.
If that doesn't happen, Israel gets wiped out on the other side of the Red Sea at this point, so that ruins the story too. But no, that one to me is more, I have a harder time with firstborn in Egypt who had nothing to do with this conversation.
Right.
They were not in Pharaoh's army. They were not chasing the Israelites. They were going to bed. The cows, he kills the firstborn of the cows too. What were they doing? And so that's the part for me that reconciling is much harder. And I think understanding, and I think I've said this before, I want to understand more about the city of Corinth when I'm reading the book of 1 Corinthians, how the early readers of this text would have heard it. They would have heard this as an act of ununderstandable mercy, far more than we do, because we're still, like I said, we're terribly individualistic, and we're thinking about those individuals. That's what we do. So, yeah.
I'll try to be quick because I know you're pressed for time, but it's interesting you mentioned 1 Corinthians. We actually have a safety valve for this as Christians. Paul, in the first letter to the Corinthians, so authentic Paul, he's describing the scene later in Exodus when they're in the wilderness and they're eating manna, and he authors, I think he directly says, like, we read this allegorically. Or they're drinking water from the rock, and the rock is Christ.
And the rock is Christ.
This is them coming to Christ. And it's sort of indicative, and my understanding is, in at least, maybe not as ancient as when the texts were written, but in at least Paul's time, there was a strong rabbinic tradition to interpret the text allegorically.
Oh yeah.
As opposed to literally.
A good rabbinic reading of this would have no regard for the original context. Yeah. That's the way a rabbi reads it. You don't care about the original context. You care about how you can use the text to make your point right now.
And that's sort of how these texts entered early Christianity.
At some levels, yeah. Origen certainly is famous for his allegorical readings, and others, yes, without question. I'm going to not. I would fail a student that interpreted scripture like Paul did in my class, because
Paul, yeah, he interprets kind of schizophrenic.
well, yeah, it's not taking. For me, I want to understand what the original context as best I can and what God is trying to say, because I feel like if I understand what Paul is saying to Corinth, I can hear what God is saying to me. When I hear what the Book of Exodus is saying to these first hearers, I can understand better what God is saying to me. I don't want to flatten the scripture and pretend it's talking just to me. Right. I want to have some regard for what's happening back there, and I think that it's hard to escape that they lived in a culture that was so saturated with violence, a level of violence that we cannot understand the kind of cruelty that the Assyrians used and the examples they and it boggles the mind. I mean, they were experts at it. I mean, they used to take the skin off of people and stick them on poles, and they were so good at it they could put the men on poles in such a way that they would miss most vital organs, so you would bleed out in agony over time. So they would carve pictures of that and put on the walls of the palace to show what would happen to people that would defy the king. That's important, I think, in understanding conquest narratives as well, is that hearing that original context of that kind of warfare. It makes you hear those conquest narratives a little bit differently. And I think that you hear the Exodus story a little differently too in that same context. So that's what I'm offering. It's the best help I can give you. It's still hard, but it's the best help I can give you. All right. Blessings upon you. Go and have practice. Enjoy choir practice. I will see you hopefully on Sunday. Maybe we can have church on Sunday. That'd be fun. Wouldn't it be fun to have church on Sunday? Just for fun. Mix it up a little.
Well, what do you think about my suggestion?
When I saw your suggestion, I went, if I'd have thought of that, I might actually have done that.
What was your suggestion?
Read my sermon on Facebook on Sunday. And you guys could have. Of course, he envisioned me in my kitchen with hot cocoa and a stack of pancakes reading my sermon, which actually didn't sound so bad at the end of the day.
You may get a chance this Sunday.
I may get a chance this Sunday.
Make sure you're set up.
I'm ready.
Okay,
I'm ready.
If snow again,
Yeah.
go in the basement.
That's it.